Like many people of my generation, I've been into books from an early age. And the great thing about novels, of course, is they take you into another world altogether. But the point about a good novel, it actually illuminates the world in which we live. It helps you to see the world differently, to feel differently about the world. Now, I believe that all books are written from a particular point of view. They have a particular perspective on life. Now, of course, if the novelist tries to push that perspective too hard, all we get is dead characters and propaganda. None of us want that. But the point about good works of art, it seems to me, that there are multiple voices, and you don't always know quite what is happening. A wonderful example was the play Oleanna by the American playwright David Mamet. My daughter and I both saw it together. It's a play about a woman student who accuses her teacher of sexual harassment. And at the end of the play, my daughter and I realized that we'd both seen the play from a totally different point of view. She'd seen it from the point of view of the woman making the accusation. I'd seen it from the standpoint of the lecturer, whom I thought was being manipulated. So it was obviously a very good play that we could pick it up in that kind of a different way. But as I say, I think it is written, most things are written from a particular perspective. Indeed, Philip Pullman, whom I discuss in my books, believes that they should be. He thinks that a novel should carry what he calls a moral clout. Now, this means that it shouldn't matter at all whether the perspective is an atheistic one or a Christian one. And I say that today because such is our culture, that anything that has the word sort of Christian closely associated, it tends to be sort of written off before people even begin to look at it. I could tell you all sorts of stories, but I don't want you to think that I'm paranoid. But I mean, there are all sorts of stories I could give you about the kind of secular culture, secular mindset in which we live, in which the Christian faith is literally being sort of washed out. Now, my book discusses 20 novelists and poets. The majority of them are Christian, about 14. 4 of them definitely rejected the faith. 2 are rather difficult to place. And a number of themes emerge from the book, which I'm just going to touch on very briefly. Each chapter is self-contained, but I think if you read the book, you'll detect a number of sort of themes which seems to emerge. One of them begins with, in fact, 2 of them are right there at the beginning in Dostoevsky. And I begin with Dostoevsky because in some ways he's the first modern novelist. He's the first really psychological novelist. And also he said, my faith has emerged through a furnace of doubt. And that, I think, is true of all the people that I discuss, those that have faith. It is the background to this book, that furnace of doubt against which all these novels, if they're from a Christian standpoint, or the poetry is written. The second theme also emerges from Dostoevsky. You remember that very, very famous scene where Ivan Karamazov tells horrific stories of children suffering, really horrible, horrible stories. And he turns to his brother Alyosha and says, it's not God I don't believe in, Alyosha, it's just that I return him the ticket. And this theme of the challenge presented by suffering to the possibility of a loving God behind the universe, of course, emerges in many different ways throughout the book and different ways in different authors, sometimes just in a very ordinary kind of way, with the poet Edwin Muir, for example, in the kind of depression he'd suffered for a lot of his life. Now, the Christian authors will obviously want to say something in relation to that. One of the authors I'm very fond of is W.H. Auden. And he's got a lovely poem, which I quote in full in the book, and where he says, "You can face the sky and roar in anger and despair as much as you like, but all you hear is the singular command, bless what there is for being. Bless what there is for being." That's how he came to terms with the world as it is. Somebody who was a bit more positive was the wonderful Orkney poet Edwin Muir. And he has a poem in which he says, "What had Eden ever to say of faith and hope and pity and love? Strange blessings never in paradise fall from these beclouded skies." So the Christian authors discussed in the book clearly have to wrestle in their own kind of way, their own distinctive way with that. So the furnace of doubt, of suffering, those are two of the themes that emerge. Third one is beauty. You may be very well surprised that I have a chapter on Edward Thomas, because Edward Thomas really had virtually nothing to do with religion. But anybody who reads Edward Thomas knows that there is, in all his poetry, what I call the elusive call. There's a kind of haunting quality about his beauty, as it were reaching out beyond this world to something else. Now, is that to be understood just as something psychological, or is it a kind of leftover of late romanticism, or what? Now, C.S. Lewis is very crucial at this point, because he believed that this elusive call, this haunting feeling which beauty gives us, this tantalizing quality to beauty, does actually, if we think it through, lead onto God, whom Augustine addressed as "thou beauty most ancient and withal so fresh." So there's a very interesting contrast between Edward Thomas and C.S. Lewis, and something to think about. I don't develop the contrast between them too much in the book, but it's something to think out. Does that belong to every human being, or is it just a kind of passing phase, or does it just a matter of individual psychology? Then grace is another theme emerging in the book. It's particularly marked in the poet Elizabeth Jennings, who had a difficult life. She suffered a lot of mental breakdowns. She wrote some very moving poems about the times when she was incarcerated in mental hospital. But in her poetry, you see her working her way through the pain to an appreciation of life. And some of her collections are given titles like Grace or Praises. And a particular poem of hers that I am fond of has the lines in it, "Others examine consciences. I tell my beads of shining glory. I count my good hours, and they guide me well through sleep," as she goes on. I tell my beads of gracious moments, shining still. So you see her working through to a very, very exultant acceptance of life, not just a stoical acceptance, an ability to recognize grace in other people and to praise for life as it is. And I think another area where grace emerges is in my chapter on Roman Catholic novelists, which I call Grace in Failure. It deals with four major Roman Catholic novelists, Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, the American woman writer Flannery O'Connor, and the Japanese author Shusaku Endo. And all the novels are about failure of one kind or another. One of the most famous is Graham Greene's The Power and Glory, about a priest in Mexico at a time when the church was being persecuted. He's a drunkard, an alcoholic, he has a mistress, but there is grace there shown in the courage that he shows, trying to bring the sacrament to people, even though it's in the midst of a time when Christians are being persecuted. And particularly moving, I think, is the novel by Shusaku Endo that I discussed. You may possibly have seen his great film called The Silence. I don't know whether you saw The Silence, about the Jesuit mission in Japan being persecuted and wiped out in the 17th century. The Samurai is another novel about the same period. And it follows 4 samurai on a voyage. And they meet a mysterious man who got fed up with the church, but still tries to live as a Christian, serving the Indians. And although the Jesuit mission is a total failure, it's all wiped out by persecution, somehow you see in this strange figure, and Endo talks about it in a very moving kind of way, something of the grace of Christ in somebody who's poor, serving the poor. So grace in failure is one of the themes in the book. You might be surprised to hear that actually another theme which merges from time to time is hell. Stevie Smith, who was a wonderfully amusing, jaunty poet, was hugely attracted by the Christian faith. She loved the Christian faith. She couldn't see how you couldn't love the Christian faith. But she felt a moral necessity to reject it because of its teaching on hell. She felt it's a moral necessity to reject the Christian faith, even though, she loved it and she was so attracted to it. In contrast to that is T.S. Eliot. He was very friendly with an American scholar called Paul Elmer More, whom he greatly respected, a very learned scholar, he greatly respected. And then Paul Elmer More said he didn't believe in hell. Eliot wrote him a very sharp letter. What's all this? He said, is your God simply Santa Claus? And then he writes a very strong and very cogent paragraph on why he thinks hell is a reality. Well, I'm not going to pursue that now. If you want to pursue it in questions, we will. Of course, it depends what you mean by hell, of course. Do you mean what a character in a Samuel Beckett described as the other hell? Or so that emerges, and then that moves on to another theme in the book, that of sin and redemption. And here I think particularly powerful is the novelist William Golding. I think almost everybody here will either have seen the film or read the book at some time of The Lord of the Flies. You remember some cherubic-faced choir boys from a wonderful good school land up in paradise conditions on a tropical island. And before you know where they are, they're split up into gangs and are killing each other. And that is Golding's view of the world. But even in The Lord of the Flies, there is a kind of redemptive figure. And in all his novels, however bleak and dour they are, however much they stress the cruelty which we exhibit in our behaviour with one another, there's always a redemptive strand through it. And my favourite, I have so many favourite novels of William Golding, but I think above all is a novel called Pincher Martin, which is about a seaman who's torpedoed at sea, and he managed to scramble up on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. And the whole novel is his scramble to stay on the rock and stay alive. And then suddenly at the end, there's a twist, and you see the whole novel totally, totally different. Well, in case you haven't read the novel, I'm not going to tell you what that twist is, but it's remarkably, remarkably clever, and it has a very great deal to say about hell and redemption. And then the final theme that I want to mention by way of introduction before Alec and I have a bit of a conversation together is the question of religious language. And here there's a very interesting contrast, first of all, between Auden and T.S. Eliot. Auden loved life in every aspect. He relished life. He even has a wonderful mischievous passage in praise of gossip. He took what you might call the via positiva. He took human words as they were. He knew they were limited, and he said in one of his poems, "Truth, like orthodoxy, is a reticence." But nevertheless, he took words as they are. T.S. Eliot, on the other hand, is the poet of the via negativa. He knew that everything we say about God in the end has to be qualified and indeed denied, because the way in which we apply the word to God is so different from the way they use the word in relation to one another. The chapter on Eliot, by the way, focuses on one particular question. A great treat over the last 5 or 6 years has been the publication of all Eliot's letters, 8 volumes of them I think we've got now, from his early life through to about 1930. And that covers the period of his conversion in 1927. So the questions I pose are, what did he convert from? Why did he convert? And what difference did it make? And there's a huge amount of material in these letters which can illuminate that. And now a person who's faced the question of religious language is the person who is last in the book, and that's Marilynne Robinson, the wonderful American novelist. And she's, one of the problems now, of course, is that Christianity has become a foreign language. I mean, it has really become a foreign language for our culture. So how can you actually talk about fundamental Christian things if it's so strange and alien to so many people in our culture? And Marilynne Robinson has solved that rather well, because her trilogy is about 3 generations of an American minister or pastor's family from about 1860 to about 1950 in Midwest America. They're very, very interesting characters. They have a very, very interesting family history. And it begins the story begins with an ancient widower clergyman who suddenly finds that a kind of vagabond waif who's been living rough for most of her life turns up in church, and he finds himself in old age, great old age, marrying her and having a child. And he knows he hasn't got long to live, so he wants to write a long letter to this child so he'll understand something about himself, his father, and his grandfather, and that's how the book evolves. But where she's been, I think, so clever is that in this pastor's family, theological talk, religious talk, is meat and drink. You know, it's totally natural to them, and therefore, if you get engrossed in the characters, as you do, you get taken into their language world as well, their theological world. It doesn't seem strange or alien. So that's, anyway, some of the themes which I detect as emerging from this book. You might find some others. And I think, Alec, that's enough, really, to indicate the kind of what's in it and some of the themes. So it'd be very good to talk to you for a little bit about it.
The richness of the themes here, I think, reflect that what you've done is almost to write a history of the English-speaking cultures over the last century and a half through the assembling of these individual stories. And there are a whole series of threads that emerge from it. One of the ones that struck me most, which you alluded to just now and which you mentioned in the introduction, is the priority of ethics, the way that moral concerns are absolutely driving the lens through which these people either embrace or reject the religious possibilities around them. And you say in the introduction, too often it's not the alleged unreasonableness of faith that turns people away, but something about it that's put them off, which strikes them as morally or as aesthetically unattractive. I wonder if you could expand on that and how that speaks to our wider culture.
I picked that up thought many years ago, and I've never forgotten it, from one of your fellow distinguished church historians, Alec Vidler. It's in his book on the church in the 19th century, a very good paperback on the church in the 19th century. And he said there that the great Victorian agnostics became non-believers, not because of the rise of science or the rise of biblical criticism, but because what the church called upon them to believe, which struck them with such a sense of moral superiority, struck them as morally inferior to their own highest beliefs and standards. That is that moral protest against God. And that, as I've already mentioned that this evening with Stevie Smith, she rejected it. This is a strong element in Dostoevsky, although Dostoevsky, I would argue, was a believer. He knows the force of that argument through his argument with Ivan, because Ivan is such a living character. And it particularly emerges in the book in the chapter I have on Philip Pullman and C.S. Lewis, because Philip Pullman has very strong moral objections to C.S. Lewis's worldview as depicted in the Narnia Chronicles. He makes him very, very, very angry. And he's particularly furious at the fact that the children all die in a rail crash and they're told when they're in heaven, well, it's like the term is over and this is the beginning of the holidays. And that made Philip Pullman very, very angry indeed. So we get this moral objection there, not necessarily to Christianity as such, but C.S. Lewis's view of it in his Narnia Chronicles. And what I actually try to show is that there is huge amount of convergence and overlap between them. They share a lot in the way of moral vision, loyalty, courage, truth-telling, and all this. They share very, very much. But in the end, even when you've accounted for Philip Pullman's objections, there is a fundamental difference between them, and that is about their understanding of maturity. And I won't elaborate more on that. But they have different understandings of what it is to be a mature human being, as I think you do if you're a believer or a non-believer. You have a different understanding of maturity. I mean, to put it in a nutshell, both the believer and the non-believer, believes that you've got to stand on your own feet and take responsibility for your own decisions. But a believer believes that in the end, you do that before God, accountable to God, and with the grace of God. So, but I think they do make an interesting contrast, those two.
Could I bring in one of the other authors you speak of, who you haven't mentioned yet, who's Emily Dickinson?
Yes.
Who is, I think, probably not as well known in this country as she deserves to be, who is, in some ways, an odd figure in your book. She's not somebody who is an explicitly religious or anti-religious figure, but who is nevertheless weaving through spiritual themes in her poetry. And you finish your discussion of her saying that her belief was certainly more intense and more serious than that of most conventional churchgoers. Which makes me wonder whether you think being a conventional churchgoer and an intense believer is really possible in the modern age, or whether modernity is separating out conventional belief from intense and serious.
Well, first of all, just a brief word about Emily Dickinson. As you say, she may not be so well known in this country, but she is generally regarded as America's greatest poet. And it was also important to have as many women as possible, as I could, in the book. I didn't want to neglect that. I try to get as even a balance as I could of men and women. And her poetry is very remarkable. She writes in a very strange way. Although she's a 19th century writer, her poetry is modernist. She uses punctuation in the most extraordinary way. She has her own kind of punctuation. She uses dashes a lot. She'll use a single word to sum up a whole sentence or a whole verse of a poem. It's very elliptical, elusive. A lot is there in the silences and the dashes that she doesn't say. So the poetry is very evocative, very evocative. It takes a bit of working at. And I'd never lectured her or done any work on her before, but I did a lot of intensive work on her, not this summer, the previous summer. I really got myself immersed in her so far as I could. And there's the sort of conventional view of Emily Dickinson. As you know, she was a very, very... In fact, there's been a film about Emily Dickinson, some of you may have seen recently, by a very well-known producer, quite a good film, but it doesn't solve the mystery of Emily Dickinson. But the typical view of Emily Dickinson is that she was a very strange, reclusive kind of figure, and she was certainly reclusive. But I take a line in my book that I don't think anybody else has taken, is that her own inner life was so intense, and her awareness of what you might call the mystical dimension was so intense that she could almost not bear towards the end any kind of ordinary human interactions. When you read some of her poetry, the intensity that she feels it is quite extraordinary. And she had a very ambivalent relationship with the church. Of course, when she was a teen, there was a huge evangelical revival going on at the time. And the headmistress of her school when she was a young teenager was one of these people who were encouraging people to convert to Christ and all that. And from the word go, she reacted against it. I can't quite remember it exactly, but something like the head said, I'd like everybody who wants to witness to Christ to please stand up. And everybody stood up, except for Emily Dickinson, who sitting down. And then there's another question, which was slightly sort of easy, less confrontation-like. Well, anybody who regards themselves as a Christian, would they please remain sitting down? Anybody who doesn't, please stand up. And Emily Dickinson stands up. She was recalcitrant from the word go. But she was brought up, the whole culture in which she lived at Amherst was very church-oriented, soaked in Christianity, and all the family were churchgoers and all that kind of thing. But she had a kind of jokey relationship with the church. To her, it didn't seem as quite as serious as her own very intense mystical experiences. Now, you ask whether it's possible today for us to be a serious churchgoer and to have an intense religious experience. I do believe it, yes. It's virtually impossible to talk about it in public, except amongst close friends who understand this sort of thing. Otherwise, epitome is the other day, there's a very good gay novelist called Michael Arditi, who's also a Christian believer. And he said the other day, today in our culture, it's much more difficult to come out as a Christian than to come out as gay. That's the secular culture in which we live. But it is certainly possible. And lots of people I know witness to that. It's just, you have to tread very carefully in the public sphere.
One of the sort of games I found myself playing in my mind as I was reading this is, who would I like to, of your authors, would I like to put in a room together and listen to them?
Right.
I could ask if you could imagine putting Emily Dickinson and T.S. Eliot in together. There seems to be a sort of meeting of minds.
I think they could, yes. Emily Dickinson was so intense that anybody who came to see her felt that she was almost electric, that if you touched her, and they sort of went away in relief after a few hours. They felt that was wonderful. That was absolutely wonderful, but I think I'll leave it for a week or two before I come there, because she was so intense. But you see, Eliot had that very intense life as well, and Eliot was deeply serious. And I think their fundamental seriousness, they would have understood each other. And of course, Eliot was deeply American and understood America and would understand exactly where Emily Dickinson was coming from. He wouldn't have really approved of her religion, because he rather reacted against. He would have preferred it, I think, to the Unitarianism that he was brought up with. But he took on a very, very disciplined Anglo-Catholicism, a very, very, very different, very, very disciplined way of life, which was fundamental to him. And being a disciplined member of the church was absolutely fundamental to him being a Christian, and that wasn't for Emily Dickinson. So they would have certainly had some interesting discussions at that point. Could I ask about one of the other themes which runs through a great many of your accounts, which is, well, you don't include Tolstoy, but War and Peace. Yes. The rhythm of the extraordinary traumas of global warfare in the early 20th century, and then living through an unaccustomed age of peace and prosperity afterwards. It seems to me that double experience shapes
the life of a great many of your authors, and I suspect of the wider culture.
Yes, absolutely, and it affects their relationship to religion as well. Adrian Hastings, in his book on Christianity in the 20th century, said that around the beginning just before and after the First World War, there wasn't a single Orthodox Christian amongst the political elite in this country. You know, we tend to think that the 1960s was the time when people turned away from the church. I think it was much earlier than that. Sociologists of religion, historians of religion will argue when it was, partly in the 18th century, but I think, you know, the 1890s was a time when a lot of people went away, and so that people like Edward Thomas, who was sort of born and brought up in that era and belonged to sort of a literary culture, they really had no contact with religion at all. What is interesting, when T.S. Eliot converted to Christianity, he said he'd never met a Christian before. So, you know, we think we're in a secular culture, but I mean, now, its relation to war is very, very interesting because after the First World War, you know, everything was let loose, as we know, and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and all that. But the Second World War brought about a new mood of seriousness. And after the Second World War, people, at least some people, started to look much more seriously at religion than either their parents or their grandparents had done. And it's very obvious in my own case. You see, I offered for ordination about 1958 and was ordained in 1963, went up to Cambridge in 58, was ordained, went to Theological College 61, 1963. At that time, 800 people were being ordained in the Church of England. It's about sort of 200, 300 now. You know, I thought I was being called by God to be ordained. Now, looking back, I just find it's part of a social trend. You know, we were all being ordained. You know, about that time, there was a new mood of seriousness. And what is interesting is that Stevie Smith noticed this and was very scornful about it. He talked about all these people scuttling to religion. And I thought she really disapproved of it. And that was about, you know, that sort of period, still going in the early 1960s anyway. That was still there. So it was, I think the mood was very much related to the wars of this century, as you say. I don't know whether as a historian you'd agree. You'd know far more about it than I, because you're the historian. But that's something that I have felt anyway.
Before we open this up,
well, what's your reaction to that, actually, as a historian?
Oh, I thought I dodged that one. Yeah, I find that very persuasive. Especially the difference between the impact of the two wars.
That's right.
The sense of moral purpose that arises not only after, I think, during the Second World War as well, which is so much more convincingly and remains afterwards a cause that, you know, certainly within the English-speaking countries, we have felt culturally this was a good war. This was a just, almost the archetypal just war, and therefore becomes a sort of moral centre of our world. Could I, having been serious, ask a slightly more frivolous question before we open it up? The first thing that I did when I got my copy of this book, as I'm sure everybody will do, is go to the contents page and see who's in and who's out, who your 20 individuals are. Right. And so what I want to know is who didn't make the cut. Who specifically? Who are those who you would have liked to include but couldn't, and who are the ones who you deliberately decided to leave out?
My choice was really pursued by the people who've interested me over the years. You know, it wasn't a lot of very, very conscious choices. I suppose it was in the case of Emily Dickinson, when I had to do a lot of new work. Dostoevsky has been part of my life, all my life. So has Eliot. So has Golding. So these have all been part of my life. There are other people who I didn't include because I simply don't know enough about them. I hadn't really got into them. Paul Richardson, who gave a nice review of my book in the Church of England newspaper, said, why hadn't I dealt with that American novelist whose name is suddenly gone from me. John, absolutely, well done, thank you, Philip. John Updike. John Updike was a practicing Episcopalian Anglican Christian. The short answer is, first of all, that I've never fully got into John Updike, and secondly, therefore, that I'm not really familiar enough with his work. So the very people who left out, because of my ignorance. I would have liked, if I had had more time and more space, to have done more substantial chapters on some of the Catholic novelists. I only deal with one novel from each of them. I think I would have liked, one could have had a whole chapter on war, a whole chapter on Graham Greene very, very easily, but I cut that right down. I'd be interested to hear from the audience if anybody they think that I should have dealt with and I actually have not dealt with. But no, it'll be interesting to see.
Well, that seems a good moment to throw this open.
Yeah, so anybody who'd like to make a comment, I'd very much like to hear from you or ask a question. There's one down here.
There's a microphone just coming to you, so possibly you could. Okay. Thank you.
I went through the 60s a bit, and rather looking back today, one would really hope in this age of so-called secularism, which I'm not sure I really believe in, I hope it's not actually there, would there be somebody an author, whoever, who would come into that age of secularism, if you like, with grace. As it was in the 60s, you had people against the traditional church, if you like, the Harry Williamses and the existentialism. So they were looking at the scene then, and they were reforming it, if you like, or looking at it. But looking at secularism now, is there somebody who could, perhaps Philip Pullman, who could relate to secularism and show the grace within it?
The grace within secularism. I mean, that's a very good, interesting point. I mean, it would present a challenge to deal with secularism, and there's a lot to celebrate about secularism. Of course, there is. I once wrote a book with a Jewish scholar. We wrote the book together, and it was called Two Cheers for Secularism. There's a lot to celebrate about secularism. But if one is celebrating that from a Christian point of view and wanting to see grace in it, then the whole question of religious language emerges, doesn't it? There's a kind of paradox about wanting to use religious language about secularism, which by definition wouldn't want to use religious language.
No, that's what I want to do, not use religion.
Well, here we are in theological terms. We're with Bonhoeffer and his talk about religionist Christianity, which takes us back again to and his idea of worldly Christianity. Well, I mean, W.H. Auden is very interesting because you couldn't have got a more worldly figure in every sense of the word than W.H. Auden. He smoked too much, he drank too much, he was louche, he loved gossip. Nobody ever thought of him. And the problem is, because a lot of his poetry, a lot of it seems very light-hearted and doesn't really usually mention religion, people find it difficult to acknowledge him as a religious figure. But in fact, he was a serious Christian. He returned to the church at the beginning of the Second World War because he realized that both he himself and the world was in a terrible mess, and it needed Christianity. But I mean, it is interesting that people have deliberately or inadvertently airbrushed the Christian faith out of Auden, with the exception of one book, which I mentioned, called by an American scholar called Kirsch, who himself is an agnostic, but he brings to the fore again this very strong religious dimension. But this was quite deliberate with Auden because, as I quoted from him before, he said, truth, serious truth, like orthodoxy, is a reticence. That fits in with Emily Dickinson too, a wonderful line of hers, tell the truth, but tell it slant. You know, you've got to hint at it. You can't placard it, because it's not a kind of truth, but you hint at it.
That's how you get there, which is...
But it's a question of how you can, how do you hint at it in a secular society?
There was a question just at the back there.
Firstly, thank you so much. I'm really, really looking forward to reading the book now. You've got me thinking on many levels, and one of the things it's got me thinking about is about modernity and secularism, and just wondering about the extent to which secularism is racialized, because I completely recognise what you're saying in relation to secularism, but I recognise it's something occurring more typically amongst white contemporaries and far less so amongst friends and colleagues who are from black and minority ethnic backgrounds. And so I'm kind of interested in that. So for your second volume, I'd really like to put in a bid that you include Toni Morrison. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
I do think it makes a difference to
my
who
wife
we go
would
to.
certainly agree with you. And it's just that I haven't read enough of hers to make any sensible judgment.
I'm sure there are many others.
But no, thank you very much for that. And the word secular means a lot of very different things. I noticed that from Alex's first lecture here begins with a reference to Charles Taylor's great book on secularism, which is an absolutely brilliant book. And if one wants to understand what secularism is and what it isn't and how it came about, Charles Taylor's book on a secular society is the best one that is around, that puts it into historical perspective. But you're absolutely right. If you look at the world as a whole, of course, religion is growing. Religion is growing massively in almost every country and every continent in the world, except for Western Europe and the big seaboard cities in America, the sophisticated Los Angeles and New York, except for those places. There's a gentleman there and a gentleman there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Harris, what I wanted to ask you, a couple of observations. Perhaps you can enlighten us as to why W.H. Auden, in his latter life, decided to emigrate to India and live there. What attracted him to that? And the second thing is, you mentioned about a religious, more religion after the war, or as a consequence of the war. That doesn't seem to fit in with the Jewish people, because a lot of skepticism arose because of the Holocaust. Because they thought, well, if we are the chosen people of God, where is God? If you'd like to just reflect on that.
No, you're absolutely right. I was talking about the Christian church. I don't think there was I'd like to talk to my friends to see whether that was so. Obviously, a lot of Jewish people were totally rightly shaken by the Holocaust and their faith drained away. But some it took them in an opposite direction. And of course, in many communities, Judaism was very, very secularized before the war anyway, wasn't it? So many sophisticated Jews were certainly not observant in Europe. But I talked to my Jewish friends and see whether there was, what kind of thing there was. In W.H. Auden, I don't think you're quite right with due respect. Auden went over to America before, at the outbreak of the war, but returned to England and eventually spent his, he had a house in Austria where he spent half the year, but he had a little cottage at Christ Church, Oxford, where the Bishop of Oxford's cathedral there, and he lived in that little cottage. And I think you may have got confused with somebody else. I'm trying to think who else went to
Possibly.
in India, but it wasn't Auden. I mean, there were great spiritual teachers like Bede Griffiths, of course, who've been in India, but they're spiritual teachers rather than novelists. And there's a gentleman there.
You just mentioned the growth of religion in the world, and one place where it's never really grown, Christianity, has been Japan. And a secondary theme, I think, of Endo's novel is the inability of Christianity to take root in a Japanese culture because it is so fundamentally different. I wonder whether you could say, A, something about that, and B, connect it perhaps with your remarks on secularism and the antipathy of that towards religion and religious
No, you're
language.
absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons why Shusaku Endo is very interesting, because it is part of his thesis that it is virtually impossible for Christianity to take root in Japan because Japanese culture is like a great marsh. That's the image he uses, a marsh. And everything just gets soaked into the marsh and loses its distinctive identity. And another way in which one can bring this through, you see, Christianity would tend to contrast the ephemeral with the eternal, with what is passing, with what is everlasting. But in Japan, there's a celebration of the ephemeral, of the effervescent, of the passing moment. You see, the contrast isn't there in the same way that there is in Western culture. So, how do you convey that? And then in Japanese culture also, but that is also some extent true in every culture, the figure of Christ on the cross is very kind of alien, and that actually emerges in the samurai, which I discuss a bit in my book. This samurai begins to change his mind about this figure on the cross and begins to see, how if you see this figure on the cross in relation to the poor and the suffering of the world, it actually makes sense.
Though I think it's also worth adding that, as Endo alludes to, there was a tremendously sort of widespread and lively popular Catholicism in Japan in the late 16th, early 17th centuries, which was eventually suppressed with very sustained and bloody persecution, and that's partly what leads to the closing of Japan to outside contact for 250 years.
Right.
So cultures are not immutable.
Well, good point. Yes, good point. Seem to be getting a lot of questions from the men. What about?
Well, one theme you've not really mentioned is the supernatural, and of course there's been a great deal of interest and quite a lot of novels and films in the last few years, and going back, of course, to the 70s, the Exorcist novel. You may regard that as too populist, not sort of serious writing. And later on, of course, with regard to the popularity of sort of magic and so on, with J.K. Rowling bringing in that theme and so on, and being vastly popular. So do you think Christianity is in some ways unconventionally tapping into that in some way?
What was the first word you used when you said there hadn't been any mention? Was it magic?
Supernatural.
Oh, the supernatural. Yes, sorry, the supernatural. That was the word I missed. No, there has been this extraordinary. I mean, that the J.K. Rowling phenomenon is absolutely extraordinary, isn't it? It's a whole tourist industry in this country now, in connection with the J.K. Rowling phenomenon. And people are so much better qualified than me to explore that. I think a person who would be very sympathetic to what it was all about would be C.S. Lewis, of course. He understood that world and knew that world. It's a world that I don't particularly enjoy myself, that world. I like novels which are actually much closer to the world which I actually know, I don't get drawn, I don't read science fiction, for example. And I've never been really drawn to read people like Tolkien. As I say, I like novels which are actually closer to where I am. That may be a failure, but and I think one of the implications of what you're saying is that actually Christianity ought to be able to tap into this stream, really, perhaps rather better than it has done so far, because actually Christianity does believe in the supernatural. We believe in the supernatural. So why aren't we relating to that world better? Why is it J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter actually gaining everybody's attention in a way that the Christian faith is not? And this poses the really huge challenge for our time, for anybody who's a churchman or a Christian believer. Well summarized by Rowan Williams when he became Archbishop of Canterbury. He said that his ambition as Archbishop was to recapture the imagination of British culture for the Christian faith, to recapture the imagination. So at the moment, the Christian faith does not capture the imagination of people in the way that Harry Potter clearly has done with the children's generation. And C.S. Lewis did with the Narnia series at his time, and as he did with his wartime broadcasts, the Screwtape Letters and so on. He managed, and which that whole generation did. Dorothy Sayers did, for example, in her radio talks. But we're not able to do that so much. Now, we don't want to be too depressing, because there are other arts beside literature. If you look at music, the number of major composers in the world whose writing is quite specifically from a Christian base and with a Christian dimension, that is very, very interesting, the number of those. So, but in literature, there are Christian novelists and there are Christian poets. Nobody's quite made the impact yet of a person like T.S. Eliot in his day.
A lady in the front here.
One of the writers that did attract lots of people's imagination was, in fact, Pullman, wasn't it? When he
yes, Philip, exactly.
Yes, he did.
Philip Pullman has captured people's imagination, right. And he's a brilliant writer. I mean, his world is a very fascinating world, and he understands teenagers in a way that I think C.S. Lewis didn't. I mean, Philip Pullman, for half his life, was a teacher. That's how he started writing, was writing plays and things for the children he was teaching. He understands the teenage mind and the teenage mentality in a way that probably C.S. Lewis...
I wasn't actually going to say that, but it just fitted in with what you had just said. I'm sorry. Lots and lots of things came to me, but I think it was when you talked about spirituality, and you more or less talked as though there could be no spirituality unless it was religious, and I think there's probably quite a big question mark about that. And when we talked, I mean, you did eventually say there's a lot of meanings to secularism, but for a long time it was just spoken of between you as meaning without religion, whereas I was very much reminded of India, and there are other very secular states, they call themselves, but everybody in the state is religious and is expected to be. It just means it's not a one religion state, which the government insists on.
Yeah.
And somebody mentioned about Japan and Christianity not making much influence. Well, I know there's a very strong Christian church in India, but after all the Raj and everything, and we didn't have that in Japan, still less than 10% of all the Indians are Christians, so it didn't make that much difference. Perhaps we ought to realise. Anyway, that'll do. Sorry. Thank you.
No. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
We have time for one or two more questions or comments. Who else would like to jump in?
two women writers that you didn't mention, Richard, were Iris Murdoch and Sally Vickers. I wondered if you wanted to say anything about
thank you.
either of those.
Now, there's a man who's read far more novels than I have. Right. I know him of old. He was my curate. And then chaplain at King's when I was dean, and read far more novels than I have. Yes, Sally Vickers and Iris Murdoch. I've read a lot of Iris Murdoch, and I've been drawn to her. But I suppose now I sometimes find her too wordy, and I'm not drawn enough. I've not been drawn enough and taken by her enough to write about her, to do all the work which would be necessary to really read the novels again and do something. I've enjoyed her novels, those I've read. I've enjoyed them, and I do think that the lecture she gave, published as The Sovereignty of Good, is a very, very brilliant kind of philosophical statement. As she says, the sovereignty of good. She has a very interesting take on human existence, and she was a very interesting person. But as I say, I've slightly gone off Iris Murdoch. Sally Vickers I've enjoyed very much, and her famous book, of course, is the Angel of, what is it? The Angel of
Miss Garnett's Angel.
Yes. No. So and it's there it is there in Sally Vickers, and clearly somebody could do a chapter on Sally Vickers, but again, I've enjoyed it. I haven't been enough into it really to do the work to and the limited number of people could be in the book anyway. So there's a task for you, Christopher.
Is there a final question? Yeah, Jonathan, over here.
You mentioned the number of composers who are Christian.
Yeah.
I want to make a suggestion to you for your next book, and that is to have the theme of 20 composers who have touched on the theme of religion.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that it seems to be happening at the moment, there's so much music around, and so much of religious music has almost itself been secularized by, Classic FM and Radio 3 and so on and so on and so on. And it seems to me for you to write from your, particular background about.
Well, I can assure you, sir, that you will be spared a book from me on that subject, because I know nothing about music at all. But it is, you're absolutely right. There ought to be more people writing books on that. There certainly should be. But I'm a total fraud, but I don't go quite so far as being a fraud by writing on music.
That seems a perfect moment for us to draw to a close. There's an opportunity in a moment for us to go and buy a copy of this book. Before that, I just want to finish with a word of warning for those of you who, like me, spend your life aware that you have a shelf full of books that you're constantly, that never seems to get any less. This is not so much a book as a gateway drug. You will find that reading it sends you off to reread the things that you know, the authors that you know, and to discover the ones that you don't. So you have been warned. Now, before we finish, can we thank Lord House for introducing us?